And you've had a good New Year, I'm hoping?
Oh, excellent. Excellent time. Really enjoying it. Nice and relaxed.
And we've got a lot to talk about this month.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's an awful lot going on. But before we get into the band stuff, there are a couple of interesting things happening over the years around the February, not the least of which is in the vinyl world. I thought with the revival in the vinyl as a medium for records, be interesting to note that on the 26th of February 1955, 45s outsold 78s for the first time. There was a report in Billboard magazine.
And before that, it was 78s that ruled the day.
Absolutely. I mean, it all started with the Edison cylinder about 1877, and by the 1920s, the cylinder had given away to the platter, and they'd just about they'd pretty much standardized the industry on 78 as the speed. And then about 3 years later, 22nd of February 1958, the stereo single arrived. You know, you tend to think of stereo being a thing of the mid-60s, but I mean, Roy Hamilton was one of the early stereo singles to make an impact on the American charts with Don't Let Go.
And that was a breakthrough for music when they went stereo.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, basically, you're then listening to it like a concert with a PA with the left and right stacks. So that was, although Phil Spector never liked stereo, he used to walk around with a pin saying, "Long live mono."
We all have our rebels, you know. We all protest about something.
Yeah, but there's a great piece of classic American radio on the week of the 20th of January 1958, and a St. Louis radio station called KWK decided they'd have a record-breaking week. Their manager, Robert Convey, decided that rock and roll was no longer a desirable thing, and he got his DJs to sort out the rock and roll records. They played them one last time and then smashed them live on air. And there's a great clip where one of the DJs says, "Rock and roll has got to go," and go it does here on KWK.
And then a smash.
Absolutely. I mean, that was amazing. They obviously got that wrong. Rock and roll actually was here to stay.
And it's still here.
Oh, still here, and will be here for a long time to come, I think. 1959, there's 12th of January, Motown started out. Well, the first label, Berry Gordy, launched his first label, Tamla, on the 12th of January 59. So it'd be the 60th anniversary next year, which is quite a thought. And it all kicked off with an £800 loan and some songwriting royalties. He wrote most of Jackie Wilson's early hits.
And then they had their first release was by Mary Johnson, right?
That's right. Come to Me, co-written by Berry Gordy again. Oh, big change in the rock and roll world in 1964 to 1966. That's basically when rock and roll morphed into rock music. And what happened in 64 basically was that the Beatles appeared on the 9th of February 64 on the Ed Sullivan Show, and wow, they were seen by 73 million viewers. That's about 10 million more than when Elvis made his famous appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show.
And only a few more that are listening to us right now, Derek.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Davy Jones of Monkees fame was on the same show. I mean, what happened was, rock and roll very much all started in America. It grew out of blues, gospel, R&B, and then fused with country, rockabilly. But by the end of the 50s, rock and roll, the golden age of rock and roll, was very much over. And in America, it sort of morphed into teen idols, surf music, Spector, Dylan, some dance crazes. And in the UK, it had a slightly different track. The trad jazz, which was the Brit take on New Orleans jazz, morphed into skiffle, and that morphed into UK rock and roll. But what happened in the UK was that UK rock and roll sort of morphed into beat groups, people like very much like the Beatles, and it was that transition in the in '64 that changed it all. And one of the great, my favourite American bands from that period, the Loving Spoonful, they came about because they were watching, well, two of them, John Sebastian and Zalyanovsky, they were watching at Mama Cass's home. And it obviously inspired them to put the Loving Spoonful together.
And that's all because they were watching Ed Sullivan and the Beatles were on.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, that would inspire a lot of people, I would think, Derek, especially back in those days where, you know, it was a rarity. You didn't have MTV, you didn't have music on every single radio station, plus you didn't, you know, have the internet to download whatever you wanted.
Oh, absolutely. And that was a time, I mean, in the UK, very much that was a time when, you know, everybody got together in bands. I mean, it was '64 when I got together with a couple of school friends and we formed a band. Never quite had the success the Beatles had, but it was a lot of fun.
Now, what was the name of your band?
It was a band called Cleo's Mood. We took it from a Junior Walker, a Motown track. We were in a record shop in Liverpool, and I saw this album, Junior Walker, and it had a track called Cleo's Mood. And I thought, wow, that's a cool name for a band.
No, it is. It's a great name. It's one of those names that we would talk about when we talk about all the great names.
No, absolutely.
Like
absolutely.
Loving Spoonful. What a great name.
Oh, yeah. Well, they get that name from a Mississippi John Hurt song called Coffee Blues. And there's a line that says that he loves his favourite, a loving spoonful of his favourite coffee. And he says that's Maxwell House. So that's a good advert for them.
Good till the last drop.
Absolutely. They've got a lot of background with the mamas and the papas as well. They were all sort of sharing groups at the time. And interestingly enough, I mean, Zalyanovsky and Sebastian, you know, came together there, but they were joined by a couple of guys, the bassist Steve Boone and drummer Joe Butler. They were in Steve Boone's brother's Skit's band called the Kingsmen, not to be confused with the Louie Boys from Portland, Oregon. And they're actually on the road now, the Loving Spoonful, and it's two originals. I mean, it's Steve Boone and Joe Butler, and then a guy called Jerry Yester who replaced Zalyanovsky when he left in 1967. And they're on tour. You can see them across America from 10th of January through to the 6th of April. And John Sebastian's on tour as well, on a separate tour, again, just in America. And he's around about the same sort of time, 17th of January to the 13th of April. And as usual, you know, there are links to the actual venues and the gigs and everything on the website to check them out for anybody who's a Loving Spoonful, a John Sebastian fan.
And that's rockandrollandravel.com.
Absolutely.
Now keep going with the Beatles. You had more on them. That's
right. I mean, interesting time. Again, this is really when it all took off for them. The 11th of February '64, they played their first ever American concert at the Washington Coliseum, then a couple of nights at the Carnegie Hall in New York afterwards. But they didn't actually have a US tour until the middle of August. On the 4th of April '64, they had 12 of the top 100 spots on Billboard and Cashbox, and all of the top 5. And what's really interesting about that is that they've got the top 5 singles on 4 different record labels. They got Can't Buy Me Love on Capitol at number 1, then Twist and Shout on Tolly, She Loves You on Swan, I Want to Hold Your Hand Again on Capitol, and Please Please Me on VJ. So, I mean, that's quite a feat.
Now, how does that happen that they were on so many different labels?
Well, what happened was the Capitol didn't want to pick them up. Capitol is related to EMI. At that time, it was very much a part of the EMI empire. And George Martin, when the Beatles started having success in the UK, he took some pressings over to Capitol, and they just weren't interested. They didn't think the Beatles were going to sell. So what happened was VJ, a small independent record label, picked the Beatles up in a joint deal with Frank Ifield. Frank Ifield had some big hits in the UK at that time, and VJ took him on board, and they took the Beatles in a 2-for-1. And I think either Tolly or Swan, I can't remember which, is actually an offshoot of VJ. There was a link between those. But it wasn't until just before this appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, because Ed Sullivan had seen them a couple of months earlier, and they were starting to make just a little bit of headway in America. And they released their first single over in America on Capitol, and that was when it started. But for a good year, it was these small independents that were putting the Beatles out to no commercial success at all.
And who would have known Capitol was completely wrong?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But, I mean, they made up for it afterwards. But what's interesting, up until Sgt. Pepper, the Beatles and the Beatles albums on both sides of the Atlantic were completely different. Even when the names were the same, like Revolver, they had different tracks on them. And it wasn't until Pepper that they started having synergy with the album sleeve, the name of the album, and the tracks.
I think that was commonplace for the time. I remember as a kid growing up owning some Australian printed AC/DC albums, and they had complete different catalogs of songs for the same title album.
Absolutely. Yeah, it did seem to be quite prevalent then.
Yeah, in this day and age, everything's digital, so albums are a little, they're not where they used to be.
No, I think people just buy tracks now. So you sort of create your own album, as it were.
Playlist.
Ringo Starr's on tour again at the moment. You can see him in Europe, Finland, Denmark, Israel. And back in Europe again that's just June and July, 6th of June to the 11th of July. Paul McCartney was on tour last year, and I dare say he'll do some more gigs, but he hasn't got any actually in the books yet.
And Ringo never takes breaks. He's like always touring.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's always on the go. He's a one-man drum machine.
Right. Smoke them if you got them.
Because the John LeBang Show will be right back
after this. That's guaranteed. Yes. Pane in the Glass, commercial and residential window cleaning. For a beautiful, sparkling shine that's crystal clear, call Pane in the Glass Window Cleaning. You can find them on Facebook at Pane in the Glass.
Hey, man, it's at the bottom of the hour, man. Do you know where your kids are, man?
One of the other bands that was very successful in the 64-5-6 era was the Dave Clark 5. They were the second most successful of the British bands, but they're not touring at the moment. I'm not sure they're doing a lot now individually. I think they've gone off to various businesses. The reason that they're worth a mention is that in March 64 they were promoting their song called Bits and Pieces. But if you check out a session drummer called Bobby Graham's website, he claims on that website that he played the drums on all of the Dave Clark 5 singles. That's from Do You Love Me in 63 to You Got What It Takes in 67.
So he's the ghost drummer?
Yeah, well, I've seen it denied by some people and supported by others. It's one of those rock and roll urban myths that you're never really quite sure about, but he certainly makes that claim that he played the drums. I remember seeing Dave Clark play live. He did Big Noise from Winnetka, an old sort of big band drum solo on a British rock and roll TV show in the mid '60s, and he wasn't really as good. He was no Ginger Baker, let's say. But he was very successful, a very astute businessman. And they were the first band to tour the first UK band to tour in what became known as the British Invasion. And they arrived on the 24th of May, 64. Another one who was really big at the time was Herman's Hermits. I mean, Peter Noon made a very considerable success of his activities in America, much more successful than he ever was in the UK. I mean, in January '65, they were at number 2 in Billboard with "Can't You Hear My Heartbeat," and they're on tour as well